Before the 1930s, in the United States, the horror film was a rather loose genre, with Lon Chaney as the, unrivaled king of the horrific melodrama at MGM. But with Chaney's passing from throat cancer in 1930 and the rise of the talking picture, all of that soon changes. The phenomenal success of Dracula, 1930, with Bela Lugosi, and Frankenstein with Boris Karloff in 1931, makes Universal Studios the home of the horror film. Universal soon unleashes The Mummy in 1932, The Invisible Man in 1933, and The Werewolf of London in 1935, among many other horror films. And these different inflictions basically turn into a cyclical, a cyclical attitude that is repeated by other studios and independent producers. Universal horror films become extremely influential. Now, outside the United States in the 1930s, early to mid-1930s, the horror tradition all but disappears. It dies out. Filmmakers in Europe, for example, their intentions are focused on much more immediate events. The rise of fascism. Only in Mexico does the native horror tradition flourish in films. Specific Mexican folktales and legends that echo the Gothic horrors of literature. At Universal Studios, Bela Lugosi is the new star. Dracula, as I mentioned, is a mega hit at the box office. And Universal Studios executives hoped that Lugosi would be the new Lon Chaney. They decide that the follow-up to Dracula is going to be Frankenstein, based on the Peggy Webling play, which of course is based on the Mary Shelley novel. The play is currently happening in London, with Hamilton Dean playing Dr. Frankenstein. Dean also played Dracula in England. The play successfully reduces the classic Gothic monster epic to a cast of 9 actors working in 2 sets. And the play is going to be the basis for the movie. But there's one snag. The screen rights are held by Gaumont British Films, who are planning their own production. So Universal has to cut a deal with British Gaumont. John L. Balderston, who was responsible for the Americanization of Dracula for Broadway audiences, and Garnett Ford, also from Dracula, come back to Universal to work on the screenplay. Now, the director for Frankenstein is supposed to be Robert Florey, a very talented new breed of filmmaker, who's hired to direct by Universal. Florey has come up the ranks via experimental short subjects. And the director wants Bela Lugosi to play the scientist, Baron von Frankenstein, not the monster itself. Universal says no way. They want Leslie Howard, who's a big box office star on both sides of the Atlantic in the early 30s, to play Dr. Frankenstein. Betty Davis, who's then under contract to Universal, is going to be Dr. Frankenstein's fiancée. Tests are shot by Florey and Paul Arano on the standing Castle Dracula sets, with Lugosi as the Frankenstein monster. Makeup is created, and the cinematography is done by the great Karl Freund, the great German cinematographer. In these tests, Lugosi resembles the Golem. He's wearing a broad wig. He has polished clay-like skin. Well, the tests are a failure. Universal rejects them. They're not happy with the makeup on Bella, and they don't like the golem concept at all. Lugosi ends up rejecting the role of the Frankenstein monster. He's not happy with the part. He has no dialogue. It's a non-speaking role. So he really doesn't want to play the monster. Director Flore, Robert Flore, now also rejects the film. Now, Lugosi and Flore are still going to work together. They get the consolation prize of an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is a classic Universal horror film in its own right. Now, the Frankenstein project, complete with Robert Flore's storyline. Flore contributed much to the script. The twist in which the monster is given an abnormal or madman's brain, for example, and the ending in the windmill. This is all Flore's idea. Well, this project is now inherited by Universal's James Whale. Whale has his own ideas for the movie, and he promptly substitutes his buddy, Colin Clive, for Leslie Howard. He doesn't want Leslie Howard. And Universal decides to banish Bette Davis from the Frankenstein project. Universal feels that she has star potential, and they put her in Bad Sister, 1931, with Humphrey Bogart. The film fails. She is then dropped by Universal, but Davis moves on to Warner Brothers and becomes one of the greatest actresses of the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s in a cycle of women's pictures. Now, Mae Clarke is brought in to replace Bette Davis as Dr. Frankenstein's fiancée. So you now have Colin Clive instead of Leslie Howard, and Mae Clarke instead of Bette Davis, and James Whale instead of Robert Flore. Mae Clarke, is best remembered as the girl who gets a grapefruit in the face from James Cagney in Public Enemy, 1931, directed by William Wellman. Whale decides to bring in the little-known Boris Karloff. As I mentioned, he sees him in the studio commissary, then watches him in the film, the gangster movie Graft, and goes to see Boris in the L.A. stage production of The Criminal Code. Whale is convinced of Karloff's ability and thinks the actor has a lot of great potential. Whale fights hard against the objections of Universal executives to get Boris Karloff the role of the Frankenstein monster. This will not be an easy role for Karloff. Boris will have to sit in the makeup chair for a month as a type of guinea pig for the makeup artist Jack Pierce. The golem concept from the Bella Flore project is